Welcome to Novara Live. Coming up tonight, Donald Trump's so-called Board of Peace has issued its first building contract in Gaza for a military base. The new EHRC guidance on single-sex spaces has come into force. Kemi Badenoch appoints a former neo-Nazi to an advisory position, and Rupert Lowe gives a car crash interview to BBC Radio 4. I'm Helena, aka No Justice MTGN, and tonight I'm joined by Dalia Gebrial for Ladies' Night as always, but remotely this time. How you doing?
I'm doing well, Helena. Yes, I am away for a couple of weeks, but I obviously could not miss Ladies' Night. So I made sure I brought all my kit so that I can still join you every Thursday, because I simply can't go into my weekend without having a little natter with yourself.
We would absolutely miss you were you not doing so. And as always, people at home, if you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. You can also listen to the show on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel if you have not already, and don't forget to let us know what you think in the comments section down below. US President Donald Trump set up his Board of Peace in January with the aim, or so he said, of reconstructing the destroyed enclave of Gaza. Showing little understanding of the scale and extent of the destruction of the territory, the board was put together to oversee the Gaza peace plan. That included the simultaneous disarmament of Hamas and withdrawal of Israeli troops from the area, the institution of a technocratic Palestinian government, and the creation of a UN-mandated peacekeeping force in the battered enclave. But it also included massive reconstruction, including the rebuilding of schools, hospitals, and homes. There was also plenty in it for investors too. Swathes of the territory were earmarked for 180 beachfront tourist tower blocks, with other parts cordoned off for data centres, manufacturing hubs and sports facilities, whether the Palestinians liked it or not. Obviously, none of that's happened. Last week, Trump announced that a disarmament agreement had been reached with Hamas, a key part of the peace deal, and one requiring Israel to agree to its withdrawal from the territory. In response, Israel did what it does best and bombed further areas of the Strip, killing 18 people and making it one of the deadliest days since the supposed ceasefire came into effect last October. More than 1,100 Palestinians have been killed since that supposed ceasefire took hold. But while the entire peace plan may look like it's lying in tatters, The Guardian has reported that the very first Gaza building contract has now been signed. It's not for a school, for a hospital, or for any other much-needed civilian infrastructure, though. It's for a military base, with a Louisiana firm having been handed the tender. Based on details from a Board of Peace official, The Guardian reports this. The base, now being planned, is just 100 metres by 120 metres and is intended to house a contingent of Moroccan troops, who would rotate from a base in Israel, the source said. It would lie in the 60% of Gaza's territory that the Israeli army directly controls. Israeli forces have also created a buffer zone beyond that area. The source said the base was about a mile from the Israeli border and would have a, quote, quick extraction route in case the small force came under attack. Moroccan forces, how interesting. Now, this underwhelming development involving the further militarization of the Gaza Strip comes fast on the heels of further reporting from The Guardian. Last month, the Board of Peace quietly dropped its plans for a full Gaza recovery scheme, deciding instead to focus on a tiny pilot scheme in one corner of the enclave instead. This is also from The Guardian. The pilot camp envisaged in the current blueprint would consist of portable cabins for tens of thousands of displaced people in Gaza and would be set up in the buffer zone along the ceasefire line near Rafah. Israeli troops would withdraw from the line, and security at the crossing between Hamas-run Gaza and the camp would be overseen by the International Security Force, ISF, and a specially trained Palestinian police force, officially vetted by the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza and the ISF, though in reality, Israel is expected to have a decisive say in who is recruited. So it's a small, externally securitized camp run by a special force and consisting of a large amount of temporary accommodation squeezed into a tiny area, all surrounded by Israeli forces. That's a particularly long way from Trump's Riviera of the supposed Middle East. The reduction of scope is partly driven, according to officials, by a fear that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will launch a new Gaza offensive ahead of Israeli elections in October, which could see his right-wing coalition government collapse. But there may also be other motives at play. At present, land in Gaza belongs to Palestinians. But in June, it was reported that the Board of Peace was seeking sweeping immunity for its members from prosecution for its work in Gaza. Included in the proposal was immunity from prosecution for taking land and property in Gaza under the auspices of carrying out the group's mission in Gaza. At the time, Omar Shakir of non-profit Dawn told The Guardian this: "By unilaterally declaring the power to seize Palestinian land, property and buildings for their own use without consent, compensation or redress, the Board of Peace is taking a page out of Israel's regressive playbook. Far from signalling an end to genocide, apartheid and occupation, this document suggests entrenching some of its ugliest signature characteristics. This risks not only complicity, but direct perpetration of grave abuses." Dalia, this doesn't seem particularly like what we were told the Board of Peace were going to do in Gaza. Seems like that might have always been the plan along. Let's see what it looks like to me.
Yeah, I mean, we have to think about what is actually going on with the building of these military bases in Gaza. Now, I have no doubt that Israel's hands are all over this. Jared Kushner is the primary architect of this deal, of the plan, and he is deeply enmeshed with the Israeli, not just the Israeli state, but this Israeli government, to be specific. And so let's not pretend that Israel is completely out of the equation here. But we are seeing the US taking a bit more of a direct boots on the ground role in the colonization of Gaza. So not just managing it through its proxy, which is Israel, but actually taking more of a front foot position in the so-called reconstruction of Gaza. It's not a huge shift, as I said. I'm sure that Israel will be deeply embedded in this, but it is a shift. And the thing that the shift reveals is that this so-called Gaza peace plan tells you exactly what the colonization of Gaza has always been for. Gaza is a chink in the armor of capitalist imperialism, and it has been for the past 70 years, both symbolically and materially. And I'm not saying that to romanticize Gaza or to say that it's Gaza's job to fight battles that in reality exist, belong to all of us. But this tiny little strip of land that sits at the interface of 3 continents has spent 70 years refusing to bottle or refusing to buckle to this idea of peace without sovereignty. And most of the global south has had to make that trade, has had to exchange sovereignty for survival. You know, since decolonization was sort of strangled at birth, the only terms on which a country in the global south can really exist is as a producer of cheap labor, as a tourist destination, or as a kind of home or a locale within global supply chains. So you have to be a safe space, in other words, for capitalism, for globalization. And this plan is about securing peace for capitalism. It is not about securing peace for the Palestinians, because as you outlined there, Helena, when you look at actually what's on offer here, it's glitzy hotels, it's tourism, it's data centers, it's logistics hubs for multinationals, because this is one of the most geopolitically valuable strips of land in the world. And so the only way it can exist in peace is to allow itself to build an entire economy that is based around catering to capital. And this is the first stage of that, because before you can get to that vision, you have to militaristically secure the area, especially when you're talking about a place that has been home to a lot of resistance and to this vision. And that's the phase that we're watching right now. And this is textbook disaster capitalism. It is textbook neoliberalism. It is the same playbook that we see in every post-war or post-conflict or post-disaster zone that we have seen, you know, all throughout the 80s and 90s to today, where you destroy a people's dreams, you destroy their political life, their dignity, their sovereignty, you destroy everything that they have built, whether it's schools or hospitals or groves of olive trees. And then once they're on their knees, once the entire society that they have is reduced to rubble, you hand them economic development. And that really means creating investment opportunities for global and regional oligarchs. And maybe a few jobs appear, maybe living standards improve slightly from being an open air concentration camp, which is not a very difficult bar to clear. But the political questions that actually matter, of sovereignty, of self-determination, the thing that the Gazan people have fought for 70 years, that stays exactly where it's always been, which is unresolved. And so this is the difference that we're seeing between perhaps the Israel first occupation of Palestine and this sort of more diffuse occupation of Palestine, whereas the US is sort of happy to keep Palestinians on the land as cheap labor, as a controlled and subservient labor force. The Israelis, because they are driven by a particular religious fanaticism when it comes to the land, are invested in the Palestinians being driven off entirely. So the fact that we're seeing this military phase to really prepare the land for capitalist extraction and commodification tells us that this peace plan was not a peace plan, but is in fact a business plan. It's a business plan for real estate, for the tourism industry, for the oil companies, for shipping, and that has been the thing that the Palestinians have resisted for so long. It's that question of peace without sovereignty. And what we are seeing here is an attempt to kind of integrate that final outpost of Gaza into that principle under which most of the global South has had to live for a very long time.
I view, especially when you look at the plans to potentially give them immunity from land and property seizure in Gaza, it seems like imperial at this point. So there's a pattern. Obviously mentioned the geopolitical significance of where Gaza is located. It's been a port city, an incredibly important port city and trade hub since antiquity. And then you dovetail that into, obviously, the Trump administration's designs that they've had on Greenland, the Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner plans with regards to the island of Sazan in Albania, which is the Strait of Otranto, which is obviously a military choke point. Likewise, the ways in which they have commented on the sovereignty of Ceuta in northern Africa, which is an incredibly important military choke point in the Strait of Gibraltar. It looks to me like a lot of the places in the world where they appear to have lots of designs on seem more geopolitically, strategically important for an imperial power, right? What do you make of that?
Yes, and it's doing that in part because we are seeing the emergence. I mean, the emergence is almost too premature. You know, we're talking about the actual establishment of a rival superpower of China, which takes a very different approach to securing global hegemony. You know, it doesn't do it through militarism as such; it does it through other means. And so the US is really looking over its shoulder and seeing this kind of growing economic power, infrastructural power, logistical power in China, and is thinking, you know, we need to put some oil in this tank, and we need to start securing some territories with a kind of severity that perhaps we didn't feel like we needed to do when we were more comfortable in our position as a global superpower. Because when you are the only game in town, you don't have to resort as much to direct occupation, because you are able to sway and coerce and channel the global politics into the direction that you want it, through things like the IMF, through economic pressure, through aid, through all of these different leverage points. But when you have a rival superpower that begins to emerge on the scene, it makes the established power, the power that has been, you know, used to this position of being the global hegemon for a while now, particularly since the fall of the Cold War. That's when you see the empire starts to get insecure, and insecure empires are at their most violent when they are insecure. And that's why we are seeing a kind of shedding of all of this language of, we do this because we're spreading liberal democracy, we're doing this because we're countering extremism, we're doing this because of human rights. And it becomes a much more mask off form of imperialism, which is what this is. You know, when you raise a population's infrastructure and the actual humans of that population to the ground, when you destroy the land and everything on it, and then say, we're not going to give you sovereignty. The option that we're going to give you is nominal peace, but through complete economic subjugation. The equivalent is kind of like how, if you have a place run by gangs, people, local businesses will pay taxes, as it were, to the gang for protection, but it's not protection from an external threat, it's protection from the gang itself. And so that is also, I think, why we are seeing this resurgence of a very particular kind of imperialism that is so naked in the way it operates. The difference is that unfortunately it's being mediated, not through kind of the poetry of Rudyard Kipling, but it's being mediated through AI slop, which I have to say is very tacky, if you ask me.
Could not agree more. On Wednesday, the EHRC Code of Practice on single-sex spaces came into force across Britain, codifying trans exclusion with precious little pushback from the top of government. In fact, precious few parties have fought back against it at all in England, save for the Green Party, who have spoken out against it on numerous occasions. Green-run local authorities in the capital have signalled they will do all they can to prevent the Code of Practice from undermining the rights of trans people, with Green leader Zach Polanski calling out what he sees as the unworkable nature of the guidance. Polanski then also went on to say this. We know that trans people have been deeply concerned about what has been a pretty constant hate campaign towards them, to the point where the only kind of coherent response I think to seeing what is happening is that some people just don't want them to exist in society at all, or to have a place where they can even go to the toilet. Greens have also made a point of challenging the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, with London Assembly member Caroline Russell writing a letter directly to the Mayor urging him to act. I spoke to Caroline early today and I asked her what it was she said to Sadiq.
Well, I had a conversation with the Mayor back in June about the EHRC guidance that was at that point being kind of drafted, and was really clear that I wanted him to be making sure that both the GLA was trans inclusive and continued to be trans inclusive in all the services that it commissions and delivers, but also that I wanted him to be showing some leadership across London so that businesses and different service providers have the confidence to continue to be trans inclusive in the services that they're delivering. And I hadn't heard anything, so I thought after that exchange, and so I decided to write the letter. And I think the thing that was sort of most important in the letter was this idea that, or this sort of urging him to make sure that he does everything possible to make sure that trans people's rights are not diminished by the way that this guidance gets adopted or gets put into practice. And that I wanted him to make sure that, that London remains a city that is welcoming to trans people who work in London, who live here, and who and people who visit as well. So that was really, why I wrote.
That's fair. I mean, when it comes to like the Labour Party, whilst there's no, as you say, there's been very little leadership in the party itself in terms of trying to push back against what we've seen in terms of this guidance, right? But there are some kind of Labour members I've seen who have been wanting similar kind of things from the party. Have you got any kind of mood music on what the potential response might be?
I am waiting for him to come back. In general, Sadiq has usually been a trans ally. He turned up in Soho Square the other day after that terrible atrocity in Berlin. And in the chamber, he and I have stood up together against transphobia from a former UKIP member of the Assembly during a Mayor's Question Time. Actually, it was during the pandemic online. But I think, in this case, now is the moment when the Mayor really needs to stand up, and he needs to stand up because there are other, the former Labour Minister for Health, James Murray, said on a recent interview on the Today programme that he'd changed his mind about whether trans women are women, which is, that you can change your mind about the human rights of a whole section of our community is just extraordinary. And it just feels like the Labour Party has been incredibly disappointing when it comes to trans rights. And, as Greens, we have all been elected to stand up for trans people. Our policy is very clear that trans rights are human rights, that trans men are men, trans women are women, and non-binary identities exist. And it's really important that as elected Greens, we do what we can to stand up for trans rights. So yes, and in any case, this is it. It's just so shocking. It's like, it comes down to things like, where are people going to be able to use a toilet? And there aren't enough public toilets anyway, let alone having, gender police kind of trying to keep a load of people out of using toilets. It's just, we just need to just be a bit more practical and just make sure that, let's start with making sure there's enough places for people to have a wee rather than trying to keep any particular people out.
Yeah, with those comments from James Murray that you mentioned, it does seem a lot of the time that the Labour Party, rather than having any principles, are trying to triangulate towards their mythical median voter that they're trying to court on certain issues. And whereas when you look at Sadiq Khan in terms of the way he's talked about trans people before, as I think I would agree with you on that particular statement, and in terms of other things where there's not been particular leadership from the Labour Party, he's also been forthright in having his own opinion there, like when it comes to Gaza, for example. So hopefully we might see some backbone there, but does seem like in terms of other members of the Labour Party, that's been sadly lacking. In terms of backbone, then one thing I very was happy to see is that there are certain Green councils, Green-led councils in the Greater London area that are looking at trying to find their own way of pushing back against these new guidelines. What kind of moves are these kind of councils making?
Well, I think, there are 6 councils in London that are led by Greens, 3 outright and 3 that are under no overall control, but the Greens are showing the leadership, running the leadership. I think, those councils are all standing by our Green Party principles. They are trans-inclusive, they're trans-inclusive councillors, and they want to make sure that their councils remain trans-inclusive in the services that they commission and deliver. And for a council, that can be all sorts of things. It can be really thinking through the procurement processes that they have, making sure that this newly in place guidance doesn't impact any of the trans-inclusive work that they currently do. And it means being really alert to make sure that in every area of the council's work that trans employees and also trans residents who the council serves are not experiencing any discrimination, harassment or exclusion from services that they've previously had access to. So it's just about thinking through every single aspect of the work that a council does and through that trans-inclusive lens.
And in terms of the response that you've gotten from constituents, both obviously broadly in the London area and in these Green-controlled areas, what have they been saying about both the guidance itself and the response that you've given in the Green Party?
Well, I think the saddest thing has just been the number of trans constituents who've been in touch, who are just really just depressed, saddened, and despairing at the way that transphobia is just being given so much more airtime and is being so little challenged. And I think that's the sort of overriding thing that I think that we all that elected Greens are feeling. It is it's really tough, particularly when local councils, they have monitoring officers, they have legal advisors, and they can be very, very they can be very sort of clear about pushing back about what councillors are trying to do if they're worried that their council is going to break the law, and so you've got to be quite robust and resilient to stand up in the face of what is, has come out along with this EHRC guidance, and but it's absolutely critical that we do push back, because it's really shocking when you think over the last 10, 15 years of how much has shifted in terms of trans rights. And it's, I just think, we just have to, all of us, do everything that we possibly can to work together. There's many trans-led organisations that are doing incredible work pushing back. And so I suppose as a cis ally, I'm just trying to do what I can from the elected position that I've got.
And I guess the last thing I'd say is, what would you say to the people at home who are watching who'd like to kind of help out with what's been going on with this, with regards to the guidance, regards to the Green Party's response?
Just make sure, be ready to be an ally in any public toilets that you, where anyone is experiencing harassment or being questioned about their use of particular facilities. And I think we just, that is just really, really important to make sure that that people realise that it's just really weird to be thinking about people's genitalia. It's weird to be thinking about, who's using what toilet. I mean, mostly people just go in, go out, use the toilet, wash their hands and disappear. It's not like it's anywhere that you're going to be spending an awful lot of time. So, yeah, just make sure to... also to make sure that any businesses or service providers that are being trans inclusive, that you show them how much you appreciate that. And that applies to, someone like me who's a cis ally, as well as to, obviously, to anyone who's trans. But I don't expect anyone who's trans to be outing themselves, thanking people for being trans inclusive in their services. Maybe that's where cis people need to really step up.
That was Green Party London Assembly member Caroline Russell speaking to me earlier today. Now, it's not just the Green Party that has taken issue with the principles of the guidelines, and many people have questioned how on earth they're supposed to even be implemented. Channel 4's Kieran Jenkins was one of those people, and he tried to get some clarification in an interview with a rather windswept EHRC chair Marie-Anne Stevenson.
One of the things we've said in the code is it wouldn't usually be proportionate to have somebody on the door of every single toilet and every single changing room asking people their sex before they went in. Obviously, if there's repeated patterns of behaviour and there are complaints from other service users who complain that they feel unsafe or that they feel that they've been harassed, then we would expect service users to take action in the usual way.
So you're relying on, say, a small cafe owner to tell someone they suspect is using a toilet inappropriately. How on earth they're meant to know that, I'm not sure. But then to tell them that they cannot use that toilet in future, it would be down to the business themselves.
I'm not saying that. I mean, as I said, it's not. We've made it clear that it wouldn't usually be proportionate to have somebody on the door checking who goes in and out of toilets. However, if there are situations where other customers complain, service providers may decide to take action.
I'm just curious to know how that conversation would go.
One of the things that we set out in the code is if you're in a situation where you do need to ask somebody about their sex in order to, check whether or not they're able to access services, that should be done in a way that's as discreetly and sensitively as possible.
Yeah, I have every confidence in the British public to do that discreetly. I don't know how everyone else feels about such claims from Marie-Anne Stevenson there. But what's interesting is that she was like, well, no, we don't want there to be the toilet police on the doors. We don't want to have the businesses to employ people to go and check people's sex when they go into toilets. But what you're encouraging essentially is for the customers themselves to become the toilet police, to raise the concerns, to say you feel harassed or threatened or you feel unsafe because there's someone, not necessarily that is transgender around, but that you might suspect to be transgender, which then takes us on to the point of, well, all that's going to happen is you'll get loads of false accusations of people based upon presumably appearance, about whether or not that they are transgender or not, which will harm a lot of gender non-conforming cisgender people. I've already seen a story literally posted today where someone was reporting in the press that there was an actual butch lesbian couple that were thrown out, I believe, of a cinema toilet for using it for what everyone uses the toilet for, on the presumption that because they were butch lesbians, it meant that they were men, because they were doing it entirely on appearance, right? And on the subject of false accusations, that was Jenkins's next question to Stevenson.
How is the trans person then expected to prove or which sex they are? And what evidence can they possibly produce in that situation?
Well, I mean, one of the situations we have is that we don't have a single document that is a reliable indicator of sex. As with many areas of the law, this is something that is based on trust that most people will follow the rules, trust that with clear signage and good alternatives, everybody will be able to find services that they want to use, and a sense of kind of proportionality on how it's enforced.
Does it not seem a bit confusing and contradictory, perhaps, if you're a business owner? You've just said that there may be circumstances in which they need to check, but also there's no real way that they can check. You can see why they're confused.
Generally speaking, human beings are very good at telling the sex of somebody that they're talking to. We've evolved over, thousands of years to be able to do that, and we do that on multiple points of information. But most of the time, we are expecting that people will, as they do in every other area of life, follow the law.
So apparently now the official policy is, well, we can always tell, so it's fine. Now, obviously, I understand I'm not exactly the most passing of trans people in the world, right? I get that. But the idea that people can always tell is just disproven by anyone who's had any interaction with any trans people, like, ever. The problem, of course, is that because they can't tell about the ones where they think that they can't tell, because they don't even notice they think they're cisgender already. They can tell in the cases where they believe it to be obvious, and therefore they think that can apply in all cases. And the point that she made there, there are a certain kind of distinguishing factors where people can just tell all the time, right? Based upon, the way in which that they are perceiving somebody on certain characteristics. I can promise you, first of all, lots of those characteristics are puberty-based. They can be blocked off by blockers, and people never develop them by going through that puberty in the first place. And second of all, even in the case where you genuinely believe there's always going to be some kind of physiological thing that you can spot, that you can tell, despite the myriad different ways in which these manifest, regardless of your sex, where you can have different body shapes, regardless of what your karyotype is. For example, even if you genuinely believe that's true, the idea that these things can't be changed by medical procedure, whether it is a tracheal shave, whether it is facial feminization surgery, whether you're getting your hairline replaced, these are all things that can also make sure that you can't tell, right? The idea that people always being able to tell being official policy is nonsense. And again, it leaves the door open for loads of people to take it upon themselves based upon what is essentially a subjective judgment about their own perception of someone's sex rather than any actual documentation, because she admits that it doesn't exist, is opening the door for exactly what I was talking about before, of accusing femboys and butch lesbians of being something that they are not, and that essentially being the policy of the state. It's totally unworkable, in my opinion. I want to get your thoughts on that one, though, Dalia. Do you think it's workable?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously insane. But I also think that for me, my main problem with this is not that it's unworkable, because even if it was workable, it would still be wrong, because this is a form of legal segregation based on people's inherent characteristics, based on the idea that certain groups of people are inherently dangerous, and therefore we have to manage how they occupy space. And that is the basis of every system of legal segregation ever, whether you're talking about legal apartheid in Palestine, or whether you're talking about Jim Crow, or whether you're talking about apartheid South Africa. These are all systems of legal segregation that have been based on the very sincerely held belief of the people who architect these systems of segregation that certain groups of people are dangerous, unsafe, or inferior. And that is what we are seeing here, because ultimately there is a world in which this legislation is somewhat workable, and it's a world in which trans people withdraw from public life. It's a world in which you actually feel as I'm not a trans person, but I can imagine that you feel an ambient sense of fear that you will be outed as trans for going about your daily life. Because where I imagine that this will end up being enforced is in contexts where you have either, community groups or cafes or local businesses or whatever, where it gets out that a member of that group or a member of an organization or a member or a regular client in a cafe, it gets out that they're trans. And then suddenly their ability to be in that place becomes severely compromised. Because, of course, you could say technically, well, we're not saying that they can't use the bathroom, because they can use the bathroom of the sex that they were assigned at birth. But ultimately, that is a violation of trans people's dignity, because to live as a trans people in a free way is to be able to live as the gender that you are, and the gender that you identify with, which is a right that all cis people have. And so whether or not it is unworkable and it is insane, but the primary injury here is not done to cis people who might get caught up in it, but is done to trans people. And you don't need me to tell you this, Elena, but it's done to trans people who will have an ambient fear of occupying normal parts of society for fear of being outed as trans, because they now know that there is a legal framework within which they can be segregated and marginalized, or made to do things such as use a bathroom that is not appropriate for them, made to do things that put them at risk, and also cause deep personal injury to themselves. And that's not a life that anyone should have to lead. So for me, the real primary issue here is not whether or not it's workable or unworkable, but is the fact that segregation has now become legally codified in Britain in 2026.
And we get to the ridiculous position as well. Like, on top of all of the things you outlined there, the discourse that we have to have around this is so asinine. It's so asinine, where, like, we have people who represent incredibly powerful quangos being interviewed on mainstream news, having to discuss whether or not they should be toilet police, right? This is the level of ridiculous discussion and discourse rhetoric that we've ended up with, because of some very, very tedious campaigners who seem to have it very much in for trans people. And again, without any kind of concern for the broader social utility of how that will actually be implemented in real life, all of the negative externalities it will have on gender non-conforming people who are cisgender across the country. It's been a whole ass mess. And I think what we saw in those clips just proved it, as far as I'm concerned. A lot has been said of Kemi Badenoch of late, that she's settled into her role as opposition leader well after a bumpy start, and that she has taken the Conservative Party back to its roots. She has the second highest approval rating for all party leaders in England, but it hasn't translated into much success, given the Tories lost their deposits in Makerfield, in Gorton and Denton, and were beaten by Restore Britain in the Manchester mayoral by-election. But that's not to say she hasn't been without her gaffes, from campaigning in the Tory leadership contest on her Twitter beef with Doctor Who, and trying to get the government to enter Trump's illegal war with Iran. However, I don't think many of us were prepared for the story that broke this week, as it turns out that a former neo-Nazi had been selected by Badenoch's Tories to run as a council candidate in the ward of Crewkerne South in Somerset. Joshua Bonehill Payne, more famous recently for his allegedly satirical political AI slop account, the Crewkerne Gazette, had previously been convicted on multiple occasions of racially charged offences from his time as a neo-Nazi activist. In 2015, as part of a group called Liberate Stamford Hill, he promoted plans for a march against what he described as the Jewification of Great Britain, describing himself in an interview with the Hackney Citizen as a proud anti-Semite. Later that year, he also promoted his intention to attend a similar rally in Golders Green, claiming he was going to burn copies of the Talmud and posting to his website that the event would be, quote, an absolute gas. He was subsequently convicted of inciting racial hatred against Jewish people in relation to posters on his website intended for use at the event. But that wasn't his most high-profile conviction. In 2016, he was also found guilty of the racially aggravated harassment of Luciana Berger, who was at the time an MP for the Labour Party. This included posting on his blog that she was an evil money grabber and posting photos of her photoshopped onto a rat. He's been on somewhat of a redemption tour since his release, saying that he read the Bible in prison and it helped him unlearn his anti-Semitism, saying this at a recent event that appears to be a Conservative Party function.
10 years ago, I was in Wandsworth, Belmarsh, some of the harshest prisons in this country. And that is because, fundamentally, I fell into extremism. I started to uptake the ideas of anti-Semitism, the very worst beliefs in this country, hating our fellow British citizens. And it was a very dark time for me, a very dark time. But I needed to go to prison. I needed to go to prison to learn, to understand that my beliefs, my views were wrong. The time that I spent in solitary, the time that I spent in the block, as they call it, was time for reflection for me. For the first time in my life, I was given a copy of the Bible, and I was able to fully understand the history of the Jewish people, the importance of Israel, and it was revelatory to me. It transformed my life, the time that I spent inside. I realized in around about 2016 that enough was enough. I'd wasted the earlier years of my life, but I was going to spend the rest of my life making a difference.
He also posted this to Twitter under his pseudonym Krukan Man. Reading the Bible is one of the first things to help me come away from this wretched way of thinking. It showed me the truth, being that God's covenant with Israel is unbreakable and must be respected. Now, I don't know about anybody else, but I tend to not be racist because I believe that all people are equal, and not necessarily because a holy book has described its covenant with some ancient civilization, but that's just me. Now, his past as a neo-Nazi activist became widely publicised this week after his selection, but Badenoch was quick to defend him gunning for a council role, saying this.
The Conservative Party believes in second chances. This is not just someone that we've picked up who's a convicted criminal. This is somebody who is actively working to help communities, especially Jewish communities. And this is what I want to see. I want to see second chances for good people, for people who've learned their lessons, for people who are showing that they know what they did was wrong.
And I totally agree with that. Zach Polanski said much the same today in terms of treating people where they are now rather than where they've been before, no matter their mistakes previously in life. But if that is the case, why do the Tories spend so long attacking Lou Haig over a spent conviction for what was a pretty minor case, in my opinion, of insurance fraud? Why was this somehow a huge deal for Lou Haig having a cabinet position as Transport Secretary and now coming back in to government under Andy Burnham, when that's significantly less bad than going to prison for racially aggravated harassment and being a neo-Nazi? Like, if we're going to do this thing where we talk about, like, the sanctity of forgiveness and the importance of turning people's lives around, which, again, like, it seems like this Tory council candidate had done so, why does that not apply to somebody who's committed a significantly less important offence? Answers on a postcard. Now, that wasn't her only attempt at making a former neo-Nazi more palatable. The Tories even reached out to several Jewish groups asking for a meeting to prove to them that Bonehill Payne was a reformed character, but both the Jewish Leadership Council and the Board of Deputies declined to speak with him. They also put out a public statement on the issue saying this. The severity of Joshua Bonehill Payne's crimes targeting Luciana Berger and others mean that he still faces ongoing legal restrictions. Whilst we do believe in the possibility of rehabilitation, this should not in this case entail selection as a candidate for a major political party, and the impact of the decision on the victims ought to be a central consideration. We have agreed to meet the Conservative Party to discuss their decision-making processes and to urge them to rescind this decision. Shortly after, Bonehill Payne announced on Twitter that he was no longer seeking election as a Tory candidate, but fear not, he will still have a future role within the Conservative Party. He's been asked by Kemi Badenoch to instead be part of the Conservatives' Culture and Integration Commission, advising on counter-extremism. I mean, this looks to me like this is a significantly more senior role than just dealing with the bins, which was, in Kemi's own words, be his remit as a councillor. What I will say, though, is that the very first headline on the homepage for said Culture and Integration Commission that he is potentially advising quite literally says, quote, "End identity politics in the state." Surely concern for victims of identity-based discrimination, which is what anti-Semitism is, would fall under that banner. Seems like they're fine with identity politics for some, but maybe not for others. Dalia, now we all hear about the problems of, quote, left-wing anti-Semitism in the media and the discussions in the press in terms of what the political parties talk about, like the problems of anti-Semitism in Britain right now. And yet, of course, we see this as a very clear case of an incredibly obvious form of right-wing anti-Semitism, clearly a reformed character as we see now. He previously had also said things about like hoaxes about Asian people and Somalis, I believe, on his website too. And yet those things don't come up.
Yeah, I mean, it's a classic case of identity politics for thee, but not for for me, but not for thee, and anti-Semitism crisis for thee, but not for me. So, look, I mean, here's the story. Okay, so a man with a neo-Nazi past, a self-described former anti-Semite, has declared himself reformed of those beliefs, and the Conservative Party have hired him in quite an important advisory role on the basis that he is reformed from his extremist past. And I want to be fair here. I can believe that someone who has been radicalized into far-right politics can see the error of their ways and can move past that and can actually play an important role in understanding how far-right radicalization happens and can be part of the efforts to combat far-right extremism. So I'm not in principle against someone with that past who has genuinely shown a change, playing a role in figuring out how we combat rising far-right extremism. And I would be willing to believe that this could be one of those cases if he hadn't just swapped one far-right dog whistle for another far-right dog whistle. Because when you actually listen to how he talks about it, he describes anti-Semitism as a scourge kind of washing up on our shores. He uses a very deliberate choice of language there to say washing up on our shores and threatening our fellow British countrymen. The implication there is this thing that we're seeing a lot, which is this idea that anti-Semitism is an imported problem, that it is something that immigrants bring with them, that it's one of the many bad things and all of the various ills in British society being an imported problem from immigration. And of course, what he kind of conveniently forgets there is that anti-Semitism is a deeply European invention. It's one of the oldest, most deeply rooted traditions of the European far right, to be particular. It didn't wash up on the shores, it was already here. But another problem I have with it is that he's only apologizing for one part of his past, as far as I can see. I looked for evidence that he had apologized, for example, for creating a hoax missing poster, claiming that a 6-year-old girl had been kidnapped by an Asian grooming gang. I looked for evidence that he had apologized for spreading a rumor that a pub in Leicester had banned military personnel from patronizing their pub for fear that it would offend immigrants. As far as I can see, he has not apologized for it. And if he has apologized for it, he's certainly not apologized for it with the fortitude and publicity that he has apologized for his previous anti-Semitism. He has kind of directly and very emphatically apologized for that. But he has not apologized for sowing hatred and division and actual material threat against Black and brown people. Specifically, the implication here is Muslims. And he's joining a party, the Conservative Party, that in my view holds extremist and bigoted positions on immigration and Muslims. So this isn't really a rehabilitation story. It's more like a lateral move within a very similar genre of politics. And it actually kind of symbolizes a more broad trend that is happening inside the European far right that I've been sort of observing for a while now, which is a split over who the real enemy is. You have these kind of old school far right populists or white supremacists like Nick Griffin, who for them, still anti-Semitism is very much like the core of the project. And, they talk a lot about sort of Jewish cabals and Jewish, supremacy and all of these things. And even sometimes that can skirt into looking like solidarity with the Palestinians, but it is absolutely not. It is driven by hatred and it should be rejected from our movements. But then there's a younger faction within the European far right and the American far right that has shifted its target to Muslims entirely. And in doing so, they've actually built this very strong allegiance with Israel and this idea of a Judeo-Christian heritage that they are defending against Islam. And so I am seeing this as kind of emblematic of a shift within the far right for around, basically what politics of bigotry they view as their most electable form of bigotry. So for me, the problem here is that, yes, he might have said that he is sorry for the anti-Semitism, but he's not sorry for the other forms of bigotry that he has, from my view, from what I can see, spread. And that to me isn't an accident. It's actually indicative of a hierarchy of what kinds of bigotry are getting a pass in this contemporary political moment.
If you could just bring up the graphic from earlier, Alex, the one from the Conservative Party's commission, yeah? So I want to get your opinion on this, Dalia, because it's interesting here is that they're talking about like ending identity politics, but they're also talking about like stopping multiculturalism in schools, like clearly caring about that stuff. It seems like identity politics to me. And also about tackling Islamist extremism. That feels pretty identity politics coded, and in supports of like one set of rules for everybody, which would preclude, I don't know, a hierarchy of racism, for example, and meritocracy, and indeed, of course, protecting free speech. But of course, they would, it seems to, as far as they're concerned, in the way they've responded to this, believe that some things aren't free speech in terms of like racist speech, which I would agree with. What's your? I've not seen this before today, Dalia. What's your take on this proposed kind of discussion from the Conservative Party that this guy's going to be involved in?
Well, I mean, it's the kind of classic attempt to create a race-neutral language around things that are deeply racial. The stuff around meritocracy. I mean, who can argue with the idea of meritocracy that, regardless of who you are or whatever, that you can achieve and you can have opportunities opened up to you. But in the context in which we currently exist, that term is being used as a dog whistle about this idea, this kind of DI scare, which implies that, or tries to construct this narrative, that Black and brown people are getting special treatment in Britain at the expense of white people, that Black and brown people are being fraudulently hired into important roles in the government, in various institutions, that they are getting unfairly and unduly promoted, that they're being treated more softly by the police, even though all of the data, like any data that you can take seriously, any data that is not just a hunch that people have, demonstrates that if you are Black or brown in this country, you're more likely to be poor, you're more likely to be over-policed, you're more likely to be in shitty housing, you're more likely to be at risk of all these different kinds of vulnerabilities. But it's a kind of remixing of that Enoch Powell fantasy of the Black man having the whip over the white man. This idea that, not only have we allowed immigration, mass immigration, as it were, not only have we allowed Black and brown people to come into this country, but they have taken hold of all of the institutions of the state, and they are using that incredible power to dispossess and disenfranchise white people. And that is a very powerful paradigm when, at the very same time that you are making those arguments, the material conditions and the social fabric for everyone in this country is being ripped apart by billionaires. So yes, it's kind of a distraction tactic, but it's also not just a distraction tactic. It's also actually part of a very particular kind of politics, and a politics that has a vision for the world that is not just about distracting people so that they don't fight the billionaires. That's part of it. But it's also creating a society that is racially hierarchized. And the irony is that the way that it's being done is through spreading this moral panic or spreading this falsity that Black and brown people are being given an easy ride by the economy, an easy ride by the political system, that they are in control of the state, they're in control of the economy. And that's why white people are experiencing dispossession, when in reality, we're all experiencing dispossession at the hands of a different minority, which is the billionaire class. They're the ones who have closed our community centres. They're the ones that have turned our housing market into basically a casino. They are the ones that have destroyed our NHS, that are privatizing it through the back door. But this politics gains a lot of traction because it offers a simple explanation for those things, and it offers an explanation that rests on a long history of portraying Black and brown people as inferior and as threats to the safety of white people.
Absolutely right, 100% agree. Restore Britain, the scrappy, even more right-wing little brother of Nigel Farage's imploding Reform UK, is taking advantage of the slow news cycle to get some media coverage. And it was to that end that Restore's leader Rupert Lowe appeared on Radio 4's Today programme. He was there to discuss the party's new economic policy paper, called The Wealth of Our Nation. Despite running to 64 pages long, it doesn't take more than a few sentences to capture its proposals. Shrink the state, cut welfare, radically lower all taxes and bin off net zero. But Lowe, he struggled to stay on topic.
What we're seeing is the gradual Islamification of Britain.
What's the evidence for that?
Or the silent jihad, if you like. And people like the BBC, our national monopoly, which, as you know, I would defund responsibly very quickly should I acquire power. The point is, you have been complicit in watching this gradual spread of Islamicization of Britain, which basically is changing the nature of everything, with them allowed to pursue a parallel system of Sharia courts.
What I asked you for was the evidence.
And the rate
the evidence that we're hurtling towards being an Islamic country.
You didn't cover it once.
What's the evidence for the fact that
we're supposed to inform, educate, and entertain with complete impartiality? We are not doing that.
Later in the interview, Nick Robinson tried to interrogate another claim that Lowe likes to make. Earlier this week, Lowe posted that by 2063, white people would become a minority in Britain. A so-called fact he described as, quote, the outrageous demographic vandalism of mass migration. Robinson asked Lowe to justify that projection.
You quote, and have often quoted, what you say is a prediction that white Britons will be a minority in 2063. Are you aware that by the definitions used in that particular report, King Charles is not a white Briton? Do you think he is a white Briton?
Well, many people have different interpretations of that, Nick. I mean, we can split hairs, but I think...
Well, you're not splitting hairs. Do you think the monarch of this country is a white Briton?
It's quite clear, and I think most British people, if you speak to them, would agree. And that is why
King Charles
Restore
a white
Britain's
Briton?
Membership is growing very fast. And your listeners are dropping equally fast because you don't reflect actually what's happening.
Why don't you answer the question now we've got you on?
You try and whitewash all of the things that are happening.
Is King Charles a white Briton,
Rupert Lowe?
Change,
you peddle DEI, you peddle all of the malign agenda, which British people have got bored of.
Right.
So
they're bored of people ignoring the questions, Mr. Lowe. The reason I ask you, and it's a serious question.
Any questions. It is a fact that by 2063, white British people will be a minority on current trends. I don't think anyone disputes that.
What I was putting to you is that the basis of that forecast, which is widely disputed and based on a whole series of assumptions that none of us know whether they'll be true or not, is that you're only called a white Briton if both of your parents were born in this country. So because Prince Philip was born in Greece, King Charles is not, under your definition, treated as a white Briton.
Next up, Nick Robinson will ask him if he threatened to overrule him. Remember that clip? What's interesting here is that, as soon as he starts asking the question, Rupert Lowe goes, oh, well, most people just broadly agree that he would be a white Briton. I'm like, well, no, you're the one trying to make a very specific demographic point about a very specific definition of what constitutes a white Briton. And you immediately undermine that as soon as it doesn't make sense colloquially in your own mind. And I'm like, yeah, That's right. I do agree with you. Most people would see King Charles as being a white Briton, specifically because of all of the history of the royal family, and indeed the fact that he is a citizen of this country, despite the fact that it didn't fit the narrow definition used to create this projection that Rupert Lowe is trying to use for political agitprop purposes. Because, yeah, like, of course you're going to try and skew the metrics just to be able to make your headline as striking as possible, to make all of the headlines, right? That's what's important, rather than the rigorous nature with which that you define, quote unquote, what a white Britain is. Now, Dalia, do you think that that really kind of exposes the level to which that these people will try and manipulate statistics, or is it all just a front to be able to get headlines?
I mean, I think it reveals so many interesting things, that for most of the, recent decades, the right have spent a lot of time trying to create a definition of, real British people that is racial but doesn't seem racial. And so they will use these race neutral terms like values or culture, even though values and culture are not homogenous in Britain. Like the culture of one part of Britain, of rural Britain, is not the same as the culture of urban Britain. There's actually lots of different cultures in Britain, even if you take immigration out of it. They'll say, the problem is that Britain is full. Obviously, they'll say Britain is full at the same time as being like, there's a population crisis because people aren't having enough kids. And I'm like, well, which one is it? Is Britain full? Is it full to the brim? Is it spilling over? Or are there not enough people being born? I think we all know the answer to that. What's interesting about Rupert Lowe is that he's not shy about this being about race. He'll tell you straight, this is about preserving white Britons. And so the gotcha wasn't about, is this about race? Rupert Lowe is very happy for that to be very clearly on the table. The gotcha was that he tried to come up with a fixed definition of white that's not just, I'll know it if I look at you. It's not just the color of your skin or the texture of your hair or your features. And he landed on a definition that he thought was bulletproof, but collapses under the slightest interrogation because King Charles himself, the monarch of this country, would not be considered white British under that definition. And that is really worth sitting with, because what it exposes is that race is irrational. That this idea of white British is not a neutral description of someone's heritage. It's not a value-free judgment. It is a value system. It is race is a hierarchy that ranks human beings on the basis of arbitrary characteristics, and says that people who hold certain characteristics are superior to others. Because if you think about this category of two parents born in Britain, on the one hand, it doesn't include someone that we would clearly consider to be white, which is King Charles, but it does include a lot of people who would not be considered white. For example, HMP Windrush landed on the shores here in 1948. So there are many, many people who, if you arrive in 1948, say you have a child, that child is born in 1952, and then that child marries and has a child with another person who was born just after Windrush, to a grandparent who came over in the Windrush during the Windrush migrations. You will have someone who will clearly not be considered white, but will have two parents born in Britain. So the test he's always would not be someone that Rupert Lowe would consider in that category of white British, and would consider the demographic that needs to be protected. In fact, he would consider that person to be a demographic that white British people need to be protected from. So the test that he's using, is really exposes the fact that race is irrational, and it's not a neutral. It's not like saying this person comes from this ethnicity that is bound by this particular language or this particular religion or this particular relationship to the land. Whiteness, like all racial categories, is an irrational category that is rooted in, that doesn't exist outside of a hierarchy of values and a hierarchy of who we think is worth something and who we think isn't worth something based on arbitrary characteristics, based on, I just know it when I look at you, if you're worth something or not.
Now, it's worth going back to the source of Lowe's prediction. It seems to have been produced by none other than Reform UK's Matt Goodwin, who authored the report's Demographic Change in the Future of the United Kingdom 2022 to 2122 while he was a fellow at the Centre for Heterodox Social Science at the University of Buckingham just last year. Here he was announcing those findings on the Spectator's podcast.
White Britons will be a minority within the UK by the year 2063. The foreign-born, people born outside of the UK and their immediate descendants, will be a majority by around the year 2079. And by the end of this century, about a quarter of all people in the country will be following Islam, will be Muslim. This country is now looks set to experience a level of demographic change, cultural change, religious change, that I think is unprecedented in its history. So what I'm trying to say, even if it is a bit controversial, is look, everybody needs to just take a step back, look at the wider trends and think about, well, what does this mean for the nation state? What does it mean for our identity? What does it mean for the social contract? And what does it mean, above all, for public trust in the system? And that's why we've put this out.
Goodwin doesn't say what he means by white British there either, but the report appears to define someone as being white British if they're, quote, able to trace their roots in this country back more than 1 or 2 generations. King Charles's father was a migrant, so he's definitely out, along with countless others, including Boris Johnson, whose grandfather was Turkish, Helen Mirren, whose father was Russian. It doesn't make a lot of sense, really, does it? And it gets worse. Goodwin and Lowe are very happy to treat a model as though it's a prediction. A model is a way of working out what could happen if certain assumptions come to pass. If they do come to pass, then it's a prediction, and then it could still be more right or more wrong depending on whether your maths is correct. And the assumptions in Goodwin's model are, well, let's say pretty loose. Here's just one massive flaw. The model is supposed to tell you what will happen over the next 100 years. And yet, it seems to take as a baseline assumption that migration trends will remain exactly the same over the next century as they were between 2021 and 2025, when most incoming migrants were from outside the European Union. But if you'd fix the baseline assumption to the migration trends of, say, 2014 to 2018, just a few years earlier, the model would make a very different prediction on where migrants to Britain would be coming from over the next century. Also especially different when there were specific geopolitical crises that caused the huge amounts of migration in terms of Hong Kong and Afghanistan, very specifically during kind of the Boris wave era that's in the part of the data set that they're using rather than the more EU-focused migration we saw pre-Brexit. Now, Dalia, what did you make of those comments there? One thing that kind of stood out to me really was this idea that we're going to see this massive kind of cultural and religious change that's unprecedented. And I'm like, well, the increase of the population up to 25% Muslim is a significantly smaller change in the religious makeup of this country than the secularization of this country that we've seen over the last half a century, right? And that's not even saying that the Muslims that would come here would stay Muslim, right? So the people who grew up in Muslim households would stay Muslim. We've seen the secularization of the education system replicate itself as well in children, regardless of their background. So there are loads of assumptions here that don't make sense, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I also know that it's really taboo to say this, but I'm just like, I don't understand like what the kind of inherent, he says that the problem here is that this is going to cause cultural change, it's going to undermine the social contract. And I'm sorry, but cultural change is part of life. It's part of society. I mean, there was a time when this land was Catholic and it's not anymore. There was a time when, homosexuality was criminalized in this country. It's not anymore. There was a time when women couldn't go out to work. And that's not the case anymore. Like cultural change is kind of an inevitable fact of society. And when we talk about the social contract, again, this idea that the presence of non-white people is the thing that's tearing up the social contract, rather than the decimation of any kind of third space or public space, the decimation of housing, all of these material things that are that are destroying the social contract, the rampant individualism, the hyper individualism ushered in by Margaret Thatcher, and that continues to rip through our society, where people are encouraged to not think of themselves as a part of society, but to think of themselves as individuals who compete against one another for resources, and where it's considered to be a positive trait that you're willing to tread on others to get to where you need to be. The way that, like, to me, that is a cultural change that has ripped apart the social contract. That has caused immense amounts of loneliness and immense problems in this country. But there's a much more explicit connection between the rampant rise of hyper-individualism and the decline of the social contract than merely the presence of Black and brown people in this country. And it also goes without saying that when you look at these models, a big reason why the white British population will be in decline, if we are to consider that will come true, is because of the rise of people with mixed heritage, which is going to include people who are maybe white, who have children with people who aren't white. So once you've closed the borders and hopefully not deported every single person who's darker than a paper bag out of the country, what's next is anti-miscegenation laws. Because that's how you really make sure that the mixed population doesn't rise. Because if you're mixed, you're not white, you're something else. But maybe we haven't got to the point yet where mixed people are just as scary as brown people.
I mean, that's the thing, that you hear the phrase so often from people who will say, well, I don't recognise the country anymore. I'm like, well, I'm pretty sure when you were young, when these older people were younger who talk about not kind of recognising the country anymore, I'm pretty sure the people who were your age back then didn't recognise the country pre-war. And likewise, the generation before them didn't recognise the country. These changes always happen. And the idea that we are being fed by people like Matt Good and people like Rupert Lowe, that ethnic demographic change is the one kind of change that is bad, because they talk about precious few other changes as being uniquely negative in the same way. I wonder what could possibly be the motivation for having that specific focus. I couldn't possibly comment. But again, it's this idea that we should live in a time capsule of 40 years ago and pander to the politics of nostalgia over what we should be looking forward and what we should be creating in this country. By all means, people should talk about how we create a social contract, how we create a cohesive society, how we create kind of a culture where we are accepting, but we can also bring people together rather than divide each other, right? I'm all down for all of those things. Happy to be able to have some kind of view of what the society will look like and be able to engineer that somehow rather than just letting the chips fall where they may. Totally down for that, not a problem. But the idea that somehow there's this unique problem of demographic change on the basis of ethnicity, or on the basis of religion, and specifically here, it's Islam that's the problem, again, rather than what I pointed out earlier, secularism. Again, to me, it seems like there's only one possible ideological reasoning for getting to this point. Thank you very much, Dalia, for joining me tonight. Absolute pleasure.
Thanks for having me, Helena.
As always look forward to Ladies' Night every week. And thanks everyone at home for tuning in as well. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.